1. Prehistoric art. The detail shown at left features one of two horses, positioned back-to-back on the wall of a chamber within the Pachmerol cave, located in the Dordogne region of modern France, Fig. The tapering head of this horse follows the natural shape of the rock. Black dots surround portions of its contours and fill most of its body, a striking feature that was once believed to be decorative until DNA analysis of the remains of prehistoric horses, published in 2011, proved that one species flourishing at this time actually was spotted. In this instance, at least, prehistoric painters were painting what they saw. At a later date, a large fish was painted in red on top of the spots. Yet the painters left more than images of horses and fish, they left their own handprints in various places around the animals. These images, and many others hidden in chambers at the ends of long, narrow passages within the cave, connect us to an almost unimaginably ancient world of 25,000 BCE. Prehistory includes all of human existence before the emergence of writing, and long before that people were carving objects, painting images, and creating shelters and other structures. 30,000 years ago our ancestors were not making works of art and there were no artists as we use the term today. They were flaking, chipping, and polishing flints into spear points, knives, and scrapers, not into sculptures, even if we find these artifacts pleasing to the eye and to the touch. And wall paintings must have seemed equally important as these tools to their prehistoric makers, in terms of everyday survival, not visual delight. 4. Art historians, archaeologists, and anthropologists, prehistoric art provides a significant clue, along with fossils, pollen, and other artifacts, to help us understand early human life and culture. Specialists continue to discover more about when and how these works were created. In 2012, for instance, an international team of scientists used a refined dating technology known as the uranium-thorium method to prove that some paintings in a Spanish cave known as El Castillo are at least 40,000 years old, probably much older, raising the possibility that they could have been painted by Neanderthals rather than Homo sapiens. We may never know exactly why these prehistoric paintings were made. In fact, there may be no single meaning or use for any one image on a cave wall. Cave art probably meant different things to the different people who saw it, depending on their age, their experience, or their specific needs and desires. And the sculpture, paintings, and structures that survive are but a tiny fraction of what must have been created over a very long time span. The conclusions and interpretations we draw from them are only hypotheses, making prehistoric art one of the most speculative but dynamic and exciting areas of art history. The Stone Age. How and when modern humans evolved is the subject of ongoing debate, but anthropologists now agree that the species called Homo sapiens appeared about 400,000 years ago, and that the subspecies to which we belong, Homo sapiens sapiens, evolved as early as 120,000 years ago. Based on archaeological evidence, it is now clear that modern humans spread from Africa across Asia, into Europe, and finally to Australia and the Americas. This vast movement of people took place between 100,000 and 35,000 years ago. Scholars began the systematic study of prehistory only about 200 years ago. 19th-century archaeologists, struck by the wealth of stone tools, weapons, and figures found at ancient sites, named the whole period of early human development the Stone Age. Today, researchers divide the Stone Age into two parts, Paleolithic and Neolithic. They divide the Paleolithic period itself into three phases reflecting the relative position of objects found in the layers of excavation, lower, middle, and upper. In some places archaeologists can identify a transitional, or Mesolithic period. The dates for the transition from Paleolithic to Neolithic vary with geography and with local environmental and social circumstances. For some of the places discussed in this chapter, such as Western Europe, the Neolithic way of living did not emerge until 3000 BCE. In others, such as the Near East, it appeared as early as 8000 BCE. Archaeologists mark time in so many years ago, or BP. However, to ensure consistent style throughout the book, which reflects the usage of art historians, this chapter uses BCE and CE to mark time. Much is yet to be discovered about prehistoric art. In Australia, some of the world's very oldest images have been dated to between 50,000 and 40,000 years ago, and the tradition of transient communities who marked the land in complex, yet stunningly beautiful ways continues into historical time. In Western Arnhem Land, Fig. Rock art images of the rainbow serpent have their origins in prehistory, and were perhaps first created during times of substantial changes in the environment. Africa, as well, is home to ancient rock art in both its northern and southern regions. In all cases, archaeologists associate the arrival of modern humans in these regions with the advent of image making. Indeed, it is the cognitive capability to create and recognize symbols and imagery that sets us as modern humans apart from all our predecessors and from all our contemporary animal relatives. We are defined as a species by our abilities to make and understand art. This chapter focuses primarily on the rich traditions of prehistoric European art from the Paleolithic and Neolithic periods and into the Bronze Age, map. Later chapters consider the prehistoric art of other continents and cultures, such as China and sub-Saharan Africa. The Paleolithic period human beings made tools long before they made what today we call art. Art, in the sense of image making, is the hallmark of the Upper Paleolithic period and the emergence of our subspecies, Homo sapiens sapiens. Representational images appear in the archaeological record beginning about 38,000 BCE in Australia, Africa, and Europe. Before that time, during the Lower Paleolithic period in Africa, early humans made tools by flaking and chipping flint pebbles into blades and scrapers with sharp edges. Dating to 2.5 million years ago, the earliest objects made by our human ancestors were simple stone tools, some with sharp edges, that were used to cut animal skin and meat and bash open bones to reveal the marrow, and also to cut wood and soft plant materials. These first tools have been found at sites such as Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania. Although not art, they document a critical development in our evolution, humans' ability to transform the world around them into specific tools and objects that could be used to complete a task. By 165 million years ago, significant changes in our ancestors' cognitive abilities and manual dexterity can be seen in sophisticated stone tools, such as the teardrop-shaped hand axes, Fig. that have been found at sites across Eurasia. These extraordinary objects, symmetrical in form and produced by a complex multi-step process, were long thought of as nothing more than tools, but the most recent analysis suggests that they had a social function as well. Some sites contain hundreds of hand axes, far more than would have been needed in functional terms, suggesting that they served to announce an individual's skills, status, and standing in his or her community. Although these ancient hand axes are clearly not art in the representational sense, it is important to see them in terms of performance and process. These concepts, so central to modern Western art, have deep prehistoric roots. Evolutionary changes took place over time, and by 400,000 years ago, during the late Middle Paleolithic period, a Homo sapiens subspecies called Neanderthal inhabited Europe. Its members used a wider range of stone tools and may have carefully buried their dead with funerary offerings. Neanderthals survived for thousands of years and overlapped with modern humans. Homo sapiens sapiens, which had evolved and spread out of Africa some 300,000 years after the Neanderthals, eventually replaced them, probably between 38,000 and 33,000 BCE. Critical cognitive abilities set modern humans apart from all their predecessors. Indeed, Homo sapiens sapiens, as a species, outlasted Neanderthals precisely because they had the mental capacity to solve problems of human survival. The new cognitive abilities included improvements in recognizing and benefiting from variations in the natural environment, and in managing social networking and alliance making, skills that enabled organized hunting. The most important new ability, however, was the capacity to think symbolically, to create representational analogies between one person, animal, or object, and another, and to recognize and remember those analogies. This cognitive development marks the evolutionary origin of what we call art. The world's earliest examples of art come from South Africa, two 77,000-year-old engraved blocks of red ochre found in the Blombos Cave, Fig. Both blocks are engraved in an identical way with cross-hatched lines on their sides. Archaeologists argue that the similarity of the engraved patterns means these two pieces were intentionally made and decorated following a common pattern. Thousands of fragments of ochre have been discovered at Blombos, and there is little doubt that people were using it to draw patterns and images, the remains of which have long since disappeared. Although it is impossible to prove, it is highly likely that the ochre was used to decorate people's bodies as well as to color objects such as tools or shell ornaments. Indeed, in an earlier layer on the same site, archaeologists uncovered more than 36 shells, each of which had been perforated so that it could be hung from a string or thong, or attached to clothing or a person's hair. These shells would have been used to decorate the body. An ostrich eggshell bead came from the same site and would have served the same purpose. The Blombos finds are enormously important. Here are early ancestors, probably modern humans but possibly even their predecessors, used the Earth's raw materials to decorate themselves with jewelry and body art. Shelter or architecture. Architecture usually refers to the enclosure of spaces with some aesthetic intent. People may object to its use in connection with prehistoric improvisations, but building even a simple shelter requires a degree of imagination and planning deserving of the name architecture. In the Upper Paleolithic period, humans in some regions used great ingenuity to build shelters that were far from simple. In woodlands, evidence of floors indicates that our ancestors built circular or oval huts of light branches and hides that measured as much as 15–20 feet in diameter. In the treeless grasslands of Upper Paleolithic Russia and Ukraine, builders created settlements of up to 10 houses using the bones of the now extinct woolly mammoth, whose long, curving tusks made excellent roof supports and arched door openings. Fig. This bone framework was probably covered with animal hides and turf. Most activities centered around the inside fire pit, or hearth, where food was prepared and tools were fashioned. Larger houses might have had more than one hearth, and spaces were set aside for specific uses: working stone, making clothing, sleeping, and dumping refuse. Inside the largest dwelling on a site in Mazyrik, Ukraine, archaeologists found 15 small hearths that still contained ashes and charred bones left by the last occupants. Some people also colored their floors with powdered ochre, in shades that ranged from yellow to red to brown. These Upper Paleolithic structures are important because of their early date. The widespread appearance of durable architecture concentrated in village communities did not occur until the beginning of the Neolithic period in the Near East and southeastern Europe. Artifacts or works of art. As early as 30,000 BCE, small figures, or figurines, of people and animals made of bone, ivory, stone, and clay appeared in Europe and Asia. Today we interpret such self-contained, three-dimensional pieces as examples of sculpture in the round. Prehistoric carvers also produced relief sculpture in stone, bone, and ivory. In relief sculpture, the surrounding material is carved away to form a background that sets off the projecting figure. The lion human, an early and puzzling example of a sculpture in the round, is a human figure, probably male, with a feline head. Fig. Made about 30,000–26,000 BCE. Archaeologists excavating at Hohensteinstadel, Germany, found broken pieces of ivory that they realized were parts of an entire figure. Nearly a foot tall, this remarkable statue surpasses most early figurines in size and complexity. Instead of copying what he or she saw in nature, the carver created a unique creature, part human and part beast. Was the figure intended to represent a person wearing a ritual lion mask? Or has the man taken on the appearance of an animal? Archaeologists now think that the people who lived at this time held very different ideas about what it meant to be a human and how humans were distinct from animals. It is quite possible that they thought of animals and humans as parts of one common group of beings who shared the world. What is absolutely clear is that the lion human shows highly complex thinking and creative imagination, the uniquely human ability to conceive and represent a creature never seen in nature. Female figures. While a number of figurines representing men have been found recently, most human figures from the Upper Paleolithic period are female. The most famous of these, the woman from Willendorf, Fig, Austria, dates from about 24,000 BCE. Carved from limestone and originally colored with red ochre, the statuette's swelling, rounded forms make it seem much larger than its actual 4-inch height. The sculptor exaggerated the figure's female attributes by giving it pendulous breasts, a big belly with a deep navel, wide hips, dimpled knees and buttocks, and solid thighs. By carving a woman with a well-nourished body, the artist may have been expressing health and fertility, which could ensure the ability to produce strong children, thus guaranteeing the survival of the clan. The most recent analysis of the Paleolithic female sculptures, however, has replaced the traditional emphasis on fertility with more nuanced understandings of how and why the human figure is represented in this way, and who may have had these kinds of objects made. According to archaeologist Clive Gamble, these little sculptures were subtle forms of nonverbal communication among small isolated groups of Paleolithic people spread out across vast regions. Gamble noted the tremendous similarity in the shapes of figures, even those found in widely distant parts of Europe. He suggested that when groups of Paleolithic hunter-gatherers did occasionally meet up and interact, the female statues may have been among several signature objects that signaled whether a group was friendly and acceptable for interaction and, probably, for mating. As symbols, these figures would have provided reassurance of shared values about the body, and their size would have demanded engagement at a close personal level. It is not a coincidence, then, that the largest production of these types of Paleolithic figurine occurred during a period when climatic conditions were at their worst and the need for interaction and alliance building would have been at its greatest. Another figure, found in the Czech Republic, the woman from Dolní Stanice, Fig, takes our understanding of these objects further still. The site of Dolní Stanice is important because it marks a very early date for the use of fire to make durable objects out of mixtures of water and soil. What makes the figures from this site and those from other sites in the region unusual is their method of manufacture. By mixing the soil with water, to a very particular recipe, and then placing the wet figures in a hot kiln to bake, the makers were not intending to create durable, well-fired statues. On the contrary, the recipe used and the firing procedure followed indicate that the intention was to make the figures explode in the kilns before the firing process was complete, and before a successful figure could be produced. Indeed, the finds at these sites support this interpretation. There are very few complete figures, but numerous fragments that bear the traces of explosions at high temperatures. The Dolní Stanice fragments are records of performance and process art in their rawest and earliest forms. Another remarkable female image, discovered in the Grotte du Papin, Brassempouy, France, is the tiny ivory head known as the woman from Brassempouy, Fig. Though the finders did not record its archaeological context, recent studies prove it to be authentic and dated as early as 30,000 BCE. The carver captured the essence of a head, or what psychologists call the memory image, those generalized elements that reside in our standard memory of a human head. An egg shape rests on a long neck. A wide nose and strongly defined brow line suggest deep-set eyes, and an engraved square patterning may be hair or a headdress. The image is an abstraction, the reduction of shapes and appearances to basic yet recognizable forms that are not intended to be exact replications of nature. The result in this case looks uncannily modern to contemporary viewers. Today, when such a piece is isolated in a museum case or as a book illustration, we enjoy it as an aesthetic object, but we lose its original cultural context. Cave painting art in Europe entered a rich and sophisticated phase well before 40,000 years ago, when images began to be painted on the walls of caves in central and southern France and northern Spain. No one knew of the existence of prehistoric cave paintings until one day in 1879, when a young girl, exploring with her father in Altamira in northern Spain, crawled through a small opening in the ground and found herself in a chamber whose ceiling was covered with painted animals, cfig. 13. Her father, a lawyer and amateur archaeologist, searched the rest of the cave, told authorities about the remarkable find, and published his discovery the following year. Few people believed that these amazing works could have been made by primitive people, and the scientific community declared the paintings a hoax. They were accepted as authentic only in 1902, after many other cave paintings, drawings, and engravings had been discovered at other places in northern Spain and in France. The meaning of cave paintings: what caused people to paint such dramatic imagery on the walls of caves? The idea that human beings have an inherent desire to decorate themselves and their surroundings, that in aesthetic sense is somehow innate to the human species, found ready acceptance in the 19th century. Many believed that people create art for the sheer love of beauty. Scientists now agree that human beings have an aesthetic impulse, but the effort required to accomplish the great cave paintings suggests their creators were motivated by more than simple visual pleasure. Since the discovery at Altamira, anthropologists and art historians have devised several hypotheses to explain the existence of cave art. Like the search for the meaning of prehistoric female figurines, these explanations depend on the cultural views of those who advance them. In the early 20th century, scholars believed that art has a social function and that aesthetics are culturally relative. They proposed that the cave paintings might be products both of rites to strengthen clan bonds and of ceremonies to enhance the fertility of animals used for food. In 1903, French archaeologist Salomon Reinach suggested that cave paintings were expressions of sympathetic magic, the idea, for instance, that a picture of a reclining bison would ensure that hunters found their prey asleep. Abbé Henri Breuil took these ideas further and concluded that caves were used as places of worship and were the settings for initiation rites. During the second half of the 20th century, scholars rejected these ideas and rooted their interpretations in rigorous scientific methods and current social theory. André Leroy-Guérin and Annette Laming-Empereur, for example, dismissed the sympathetic magic theory because statistical analysis of debris from human settlements revealed that the animals used most frequently for food were not the ones traditionally portrayed in caves. Researchers continue to discover new cave images and to correct earlier errors of fact or interpretation. A study of the Altamira cave in the 1980s led anthropologist Leslie G. Freeman to conclude that the artists had faithfully represented a herd of bison during the mating season. Instead of being dead, asleep, or disabled, as earlier observers had thought, the animals were dust-wallowing, common behavior during the mating season. Similar thinking has led to a more recent interpretation of cave art by archaeologist Steve Mithen. In his detailed study of the motifs of the art and its placement within caves, Mithen argued that hoof prints, patterns of animal feces, and hide colorings were recorded and used as a text to teach novice hunters within a group about the seasonal appearance and behavior of the animals they hunted. The fact that so much cave art is hidden deep in almost inaccessible parts of caves, indeed, the fact that it is placed within caves at all, suggested to Mithen that this knowledge was intended for a privileged group and that certain individuals or groups were excluded from acquiring that knowledge. South African rock art expert David Lewis Williams has suggested a different interpretation. Using a deep comparative knowledge of art made by hunter-gatherer communities that are still in existence, Lewis Williams argued that Upper Paleolithic cave art is best understood in terms of shamanism, the belief that certain people can travel outside of their bodies in order to mediate between the worlds of the living and the spirits. Traveling under the ground as a spirit, particularly within caves, or conceptually within the stone walls of the cave, Upper Paleolithic shamans would have participated in ceremonies that involved hallucinations. Images conceived during this trance-like state would likely combine recognizable and abstract symbols. In addition, Lewis Williams interprets the stenciled human handprints found on the cave walls, CFIG, as traces of the non-shaman participants in the ritual reaching toward and connecting with the shaman spirits traveling within the rock. Although the hypotheses that seek to explain cave art have changed and evolved over time, there has always been agreement that decorated caves must have had a special meaning because people returned to them time after time over many generations, in some cases over thousands of years. Perhaps Upper Paleolithic cave art was the product of rituals intended to gain the favor of the supernatural. Perhaps because much of the art was made deep inside the caves and nearly inaccessible, its significance may have had less to do with the finished painting than with the very act of creation. Artifacts and footprints suggest that the subterranean galleries, which were far from living quarters, had a religious or magical function. Perhaps the experience of exploring the cave may have been significant to the image makers. Musical instruments, such as bone flutes, have been found in the caves, implying that even acoustical properties may have had a role to play. Chauvet, one of the earliest known sites of prehistoric cave paintings, discovered in December 1994, is the Chauvet Cave near Vallon-Pont-d'Arc in southeastern France. It is a tantalizing trove of hundreds of paintings. Fig. 10. The most dramatic of the images depict grazing, running, or resting animals, including wild horses, bison, mammoths, bears, panthers, owls, deer, aurochs, woolly rhinoceroses, and wild goats. Also included are occasional humans, both male and female, many handprints, and hundreds of geometric markings such as grids, circles, and dots. Footprints in the Chauvet Cave, left in soft clay by a child, go to a room containing bear skulls. The charcoal used to draw the rhinos has been radiocarbon dated to 32,410 years old. Lascaux. The best-known cave paintings are those found in 1940 at Lascaux, in the Dordogne region of southern France. See Figs. 11. 12. They have been dated to about 15,000 BCE. Open to the public after World War II, the Prehistoric Museum at Lascaux soon became one of the most popular tourist sites in France. Too popular, because the visitors brought heat, humidity, exhaled carbon dioxide, and other contaminants. The cave was closed to the public in 1963 so that conservators could battle an aggressive fungus. Eventually they won, but instead of reopening the site, the authorities created a facsimile of it. Visitors at what is called Lascaux II may now view copies of the paintings without harming the precious originals. The scenes they view are truly remarkable. Lascaux has about 600 paintings and 1,500 engravings. In the Hall of Bulls, Fig. 11, the Lascaux painters depicted cows, bulls, horses, and deer along the natural edges of the rock, where the smooth white limestone of the ceiling and upper wall meets a rougher surface below. They also utilized the curving wall to suggest space. The animals appear singly, in rows, face to face, tail to tail, and even painted on top of one another. Their most characteristic features have been emphasized. Horns, eyes, and hooves are shown as seen from the front, yet heads and bodies are rendered in profile in a system known as a composite pose. The animals are full of life and energy, and the accuracy in the drawing of their silhouettes, or outlines, is remarkable. Painters worked not only in large caverns, but also far back in the smallest chambers and recesses, many of which are almost inaccessible today. Small stone lamps found in such caves, over 100 lamps have been found at Lascaux, indicate that the artists worked in flickering light obtained from burning animal fat. Although 1 pound of fat would burn for 24 hours and produce no soot, the light would not have been as strong as that created by a candle. One scene at Lascaux was discovered in a remote setting on a wall at the bottom of a 16-foot shaft that contained a stone lamp and spears. The scene is unusual because it is the only painting in the cave complex that seems to tell a story. Fig. 12. and it is stylistically different from the other paintings at Lascaux. A figure who could be a hunter, greatly simplified in form but recognizably male and with the head of a bird or wearing a bird's head mask, appears to be lying on the ground. A great bison looms above him. Below him lie a staff, or baton, and a spear thrower, a device that allowed hunters to throw farther and with greater force, the outer end of which has been carved in the shape of a bird. The long, diagonal line slanting across the bison's hindquarters may be a spear. The bison has been disemboweled and will soon die. To the left of the cleft in the wall a woolly rhinoceros seems to run off. Why did the artist portray the man as only a stick-like figure when the bison was rendered with such accurate detail? Does the painting illustrate a story or a myth regarding the death of a hero? Is it a record of an actual event? Or does it depict the vision of a shaman? Altamira, the cave paintings at Altamira. Near Santander in the Cantabrian Mountains in Spain, the first to be discovered and attributed to the Upper Paleolithic period, have been recently dated to about 12,500 BCE. The Altamira artists created sculptural effects by painting over and around natural irregularities in the cave walls and ceilings. To produce the herd of bison on the ceiling of the main cavern, Fig. 13, they used rich red and brown ochre to paint the large areas of the animal's shoulders, backs, and flanks, then sharpened the contours of the rocks and added the details of the legs, tails, heads, and horns in black and brown. They mixed yellow and brown from iron-based ochre to make the red tones, and they derived black from manganese or charcoal. Cave sculptures. Caves were sometimes adorned with relief sculpture as well as paintings. At Altamira, an artist simply heightened the resemblance of a natural projecting rock to a similar and familiar animal form. Other reliefs were created by modeling, or shaping, the damp clay of the cave's floor. An excellent example of such work in clay is preserved at Le Tuc d'Audebert, south of the Dordogne region of France. Here the sculptor created two bison leaning against a ridge of rock, Fig. 14. Although the beasts are modeled in very high relief, they extend well forward from the background. They display the same conventions as in earlier painted ones, with emphasis on the broad masses of the meat-bearing flanks and shoulders. To make the animals even more lifelike, their creator engraved short parallel lines below their necks to represent their shaggy coats. Numerous small footprints found in the clay floor of this cave suggest that important group rites took place here. The Neolithic period. Today, advances in technology, medicine, transportation, and electronic communication change human experience in a generation. Many thousands of years ago, change took place much more slowly. In the 10th millennium BCE, the world had already entered the present interglacial period, and our modern climate was taking shape. The world was warming up, and this affected the distribution, density, and stability of plant and animal life as well as marine and aquatic resources. However, the Ice Age ended so gradually and unevenly among regions that people could not have known what was happening. One of the fundamental changes that took place in our prehistoric past was in the relationship people had with their environment. After millennia of established interactions between people and wild plants and animals, ranging from opportunistic foraging to well-scheduled gathering and collecting, people gradually started to exert increasing control over the land and its resources. Seen from the modern perspective, this change in economy seems abrupt and complete. Different communities adopted and adapted new sets of technologies, skills, and plant and animal species that allowed them to produce food. This was the origin of plant and animal domestication. Wheat and barley were cultivated, sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs were bred. This new economy appeared at different rates and to varying degrees of completeness in different parts of the Near East and Europe, and no community relied exclusively on the cultivation of plants or on breeding animals. Instead, they balanced hunting, gathering, farming, and animal breeding in order to maintain a steady food supply. Architecture. At the same time as these new food technologies and species appeared, people began to establish stronger, more lasting connections to particular places in the landscape. The beginnings of architecture in Europe are marked by the building of human social environments made up of simple but durable structures constructed of clay, mud, dung, and straw interwoven among wooden posts. While some of these buildings were simple huts, used for no more than a season at a time, others were much more substantial, with foundations made of stone, set into trenches, and supporting walls of large timbers. Some were constructed from simple bricks made of clay, mud, and straw, shaped in rectangular molds and then dried in the sun. Regardless of the technique used, the result was the same: people developed a new attachment to the land, and with settlement came a new kind of social life. At the site of Lepenski Vir, on the Serbian bank of the Danube River, rows of trapezoidal buildings made of wooden posts, branches, mud, and clay, set on stone foundations and with stone-faced hearths, face the river from which the inhabitants took large fish. Fig. 15. Although this site dates to between 6300 and 5500 BCE, there is little evidence for the domestication of plants and animals that might be expected at this time in association with an architectural settlement. Archaeologists found human burials under the floors of these structures, as well as in the spaces between individual buildings. In some houses, extraordinary art was found, made of carefully packed and shaped river boulders. Fig. 16. Some of the boulders appear to represent human forms. Others look more like fish. A few seem to consist of mixtures of human and fish features. Here we have a site with a confusing combination of architecture with a non-domesticated economy, very distinctive art, and many burials. Archaeologists interpret such sites as temporary habitations where people carried out special rites and activities linked to death and to the natural and wild worlds. In such settlements, art played a role. In some places, early architecture was dramatic and long-lasting, with the repeated building, sometimes over 1,000 years or more, of house upon house in successive architectural generations, resulting in the gradual rise of great mounds of villages referred to as tells or mound settlements. A particularly spectacular example is Çatalhöyük in the Konya Plain in central Turkey, where the first traces of a village date to 7400 BCE in the early Neolithic period. The oldest part of the site consists of many densely clustered houses separated by areas of rubbish. They were made of rectangular mud bricks held together with mortar. Walls, floors, and ceilings were covered with plaster and lime-based paint and were frequently replastered and repainted. The site was large and was home to as many as 3,000 people at any one time. Beyond the early date of the site and its size and population, the settlement at Çatalhöyük is important to the history of art for two reasons: the picture it provides of the use of early architecture and the sensational art that has been found within its buildings. Archaeologists and anthropologists often assume that the decision to create buildings such as the houses at Neolithic sites came from a universal need for shelter from the elements. However, as suggested by the special nature of the activities at Lepenski Vir, recent work at Çatalhöyük also shows clearly that while structures did provide shelter, early houses had much more significant functions for the communities of people who lived in them. For the Neolithic people of Çatalhöyük, their houses were the key component of their worldview. Most importantly, they became an emblem of the spirit and history of a community. The building of house upon house created a historical continuity that outlasted any human lifetime. Indeed, some house rebuilding sequences lasted many hundreds of years. And the seasonal replastering and repainting of walls and floors only enhanced the sense of long-term continuity that made these buildings history makers. In fact, Ian Hodder, the director of excavations at Çatalhöyük, and his colleagues call some of them history houses and have found no evidence to suggest that they were shrines or temples as earlier interpreters had mistakenly concluded. As at Lepenski Vir, the dead were buried under the floors of many of the buildings at Çatalhöyük, so the site connected the community's past, present, and future. While there were no burials in some houses, a few contained between 30 and 60 bodies, and one had 62 burials, including people who had lived their lives in other parts of the village. Periodically, perhaps to mark special community events and ceremonies, people dug down into the floors of their houses and removed the heads of the long deceased, then buried the skulls in new graves under the floors. Skulls were also placed in the foundations of new houses as they were built and rebuilt, and in other special deposits around the settlement. In one extraordinary burial, a deceased woman holds in her arms a man's skull that had been plastered and painted. Perhaps it, too, had been removed from an earlier underfloor grave. The houses of Catalhoyuk were powerful places not only because of the depths of their histories, but also because of the extraordinary art that decorated their interiors. Painted on the walls of some of the houses are violent and wild scenes. In some, humans are represented without heads as if they had been decapitated. Vultures or other birds of prey appear huge next to them, and narratives seem to highlight dangerous interactions between people and animals. In one painting, Fig. 17, a huge, horned wild animal is surrounded by small humans who are jumping or running. One of them is pulling on something sticking out of the deer's mouth, perhaps its tongue. There is an emphasis on maleness. Some of the human figures are bearded and the deer has an erect penis. Archaeologists have interpreted the scene as a dangerous game or ritual of baiting and taunting a wild animal. In other paintings, people hunt or tease boars or bulls. Conservation of the wall paintings is highly complex, and since many of the most dramatic examples were excavated before modern preservation techniques existed, we must rely on the archaeologists' narrative descriptions or quick field sketches. Other representations of wild animals are modeled in relief on the interior walls, most frequently the heads and horns of bulls. In some houses, people placed boar tusks, vulture skulls, and fox and weasel teeth under the floors. In at least one case, they dug into previous house generations to retrieve the plastered and painted heads of bulls. Sites such as Lepenski Vir and Catalhoyuk have forced archaeologists to think in new ways about the role of architecture and art in prehistoric communities. Critically, the mixture of shelter, architecture, art, spirit, ritual, and ceremony at these and many other Neolithic settlements makes us realize that we cannot easily distinguish between domestic and sacred architecture. This point re-emerges from the recent work at Stonehenge in England. In addition, the clear and repeated emphasis on death, violence, wild animals, and male body parts at Catalhoyuk has challenged traditional interpretations of the Neolithic worldview that concentrated on representations of the female body, human fertility, and cults of the mother goddess. Most Neolithic architectural sites were not as visually sensational as Catalhoyuk. At the site of Sesklo in northern Greece, dated to 6500 BCE, people built stone-based, long-lasting structures in one part of a village and less substantial mud, clay, and wood buildings in another part. The stone-based buildings may have had a special function within the community, whether ritual, crafts-based, or political is difficult to determine. Since they were rebuilt again and again over a long period of time, the part of the village where they were located grew vertically into a mound or tell. Some buildings had easily recognizable functions, such as a place for making ceramic vessels. The distinction between the area of the longer-lasting, often rebuilt buildings and the more temporary structures is clear in the style of architecture as well as in the quality of artifacts found. Finer, decorated pottery is more abundant in the former. In different regions of Europe, people created architecture in different ways. The crowded buildings of Catalhoyuk differed from the structures at Sesklo, and these differed from the trapezoidal huts at Lepenski Vir. To the northwest, in Germany and Central Europe, Neolithic villages typically consisted of 3 or 4 long timber buildings, each up to 150 feet long, housing 45 to 50 people. The structures were rectangular, with a row of posts down the center supporting a ridgepole, a long horizontal beam against which the slanting roof poles were braced. The walls were probably made of wattle and daub and roofed with thatch, plant materials such as reeds or straw tied over a framework of poles. These houses also included large granaries, or storage spaces for the harvest. Some buildings contained sections for animals and for people. Around 4000 BCE, Neolithic settlers began to locate their communities at defensible sites, near rivers, on plateaus, or in swamps. For additional protection, they also frequently surrounded their settlements with wooden walls, earth embankments, and ditches. Ceremonial and tomb architecture in Western and Northern Europe, people erected huge stones to build ceremonial structures and tombs. In some cases, they had to transport these great stones over long distances. The monuments thus created are examples of what is known as megalithic architecture, the descriptive term derived from the Greek words for large and stone. Archaeologists disagree about the nature of the societies that created these monuments. Some believe they reflect complex, stratified societies in which powerful religious or political leaders dictated the design of these monuments and inspired large numbers of people to contribute their labor to such engineering projects. Skilled engineers would have devised the methods for shaping, transporting, and aligning the stones. Other interpreters argue that these massive monuments are clear evidence for shared collaboration within and between groups, with people working together on a common project, the successful completion of which fueled social cohesion in the absence of a powerful individual. Many of these megalithic structures are associated with death. Most recent interpretations stress the role of death and burial as fundamental, public performances in which individual and group identity, cohesion, and dispute were played out. In this reasoning, death and its rituals are viewed as theater, with the deceased as well as grave goods perceived as props, the monument as a stage, the celebrants and mourners as actors, and the entire event proceeding in terms of inscript with narrative and plot. Elaborate megalithic tombs first appeared in the Neolithic period. Some were built for single burials, others consisted of multiple burial chambers. The simplest type was the dolmen, built on the post and lintel principle. The tomb chamber was formed of huge upright stones supporting one or more table-like rocks, or capstones. The structure was then mounded over with smaller rocks and dirt to form a cairn or artificial hill. A more imposing type of structure was the passage grave, in which narrow, stone-lined passageways led into a large room at the center. At Newgrange, in Ireland, the mound of an elaborate passage grave, Fig. 19, originally stood 44 feet high and measured about 280 feet in diameter. The mound was built of sod and river pebbles and was set off by a circle of engraved standing stones around its perimeter. Its passageway, 62 feet long and lined with standing stones, leads into a three-part chamber with a corbel vault rising to a height of 19 feet. Some of the stones are engraved with linear designs, mainly rings, spirals, and diamond shapes. These patterns may have been marked out using strings or compasses, then carved by picking at the rock surface with tools made of antlers. Recent detailed analysis of the art engraved on passage graves like Newgrange, but also at Knowth in Ireland, suggests that the images are endoptic, and that we should understand them in terms of the neuropsychological effect they would have had on people visiting the tomb. These effects may have included hallucinations. Archaeologists argue that key endoptic motifs were positioned at entrances and other important thresholds inside the tomb, and that they played important roles in ritual or political ceremonies that centered around death, burial, and the commemoration and visitation of the deceased by the living. Stonehenge, of all the megalithic monuments in Europe, the one that has stirred the imagination of the public most strongly is Stonehenge, on Salisbury Plain in southern England, Figs. 20. 21. A henge is a circle of stones or posts, often surrounded by a ditch with built-up embankments. Laying out such circles with accuracy would have posed no particular problem. Architects likely relied on the human compass, a simple but effective surveying method that persisted well into modern times. All that is required is a length of cord either cut or knotted to mark the desired radius of the circle. A person holding one end of the cord is stationed in the center. A co-worker, holding the other end and keeping the cord taut, steps off the circle's circumference. By the time of Stonehenge's construction, cords and ropes were readily available. Stonehenge is not the largest such circle from the Neolithic period, but it is one of the most complex, with 8 different phases of construction and activity starting in 3000 BCE during the Neolithic period, and stretching over a millennium and a half through the Bronze Age. The site started as a cemetery of cremation burials marked by a circle of blue stones. Through numerous sequences of alterations and rebuildings, it continued to function as a domain of the dead. Between 2900 and 2600 BCE, the blue stones were rearranged into an arc. Around 2500 BCE, a circle of sarsen stones was used to create the famous appearance of the site. Sarsen is a gray sandstone, and the blue stones were rearranged within the sarsens. The center of the site was now dominated by a horseshoe-shaped arrangement of 5 sandstone trilithons, or pairs of upright stones topped by lintels. The one at the middle stood considerably taller than the rest, rising to a height of 24 feet, and its lintel was more than 15 feet long and 3 feet thick. This group was surrounded by the so-called sarsen circle, a ring of sandstone uprights weighing up to 26 tons each and averaging 13 feet 6 inches tall. This circle, 106 feet in diameter, was capped by a continuous lintel. The uprights taper slightly toward the top, and the gently curved lintel sections were secured by mortise and tenon joints, that is, joints made by a conical projection at the top of each upright that fits like a peg into a hole in the lintel. Over the next 1,000 years, people continued to alter the arrangement of the bluestones, and cremation burials continued in pits at the site. The differences in the types of stone used in the different phases of construction are significant. The use of bluestone in the early phases is particularly important. Unlike the sarsen stone, bluestone was not locally available and would have been transported over 150 miles from the west, where it had been quarried in the mountains of West Wales. The means of transporting the bluestones such distances remains a source of great debate. Some argue that they were floated around the coast on great barges, others hold that they traveled overland on wooden rollers. Regardless of the means of transport, the use of this distant material tells us that the people who first transformed the Stonehenge landscape into a ceremonial site probably also had their ancestral origins in the West. By bringing the bluestones and using them in the early Stonehenge cemetery, these migrants made a powerful connection with their homelands. Through the ages, many theories have been advanced to explain Stonehenge. In the Middle Ages, people thought that Merlin, the legendary magician of King Arthur, had built it. Later, the site was erroneously associated with the rituals of the Celtic Druids. Because it is oriented in relation to the movement of the sun, some people have argued that it may have been an observatory or that it had special importance as a calendar for regulating early agricultural schedules. Today, none of these ideas is supported by archaeologists and the current evidence. We now believe that Stonehenge was the site of ceremonies linked to death and burial. This theory has been constructed from evidence that looks not only at the stone circles but also at the nearby sites dating from the periods when Stonehenge was in use. Fig. 22. A new generation of archaeologists, led by Mike Parker Pearson, has pioneered this contextual approach to the puzzle of Stonehenge. The settlements built near Stonehenge follow circular layouts, connecting them in plan to the ceremonial site. Fig. 23. Unlike the more famous monument, however, these habitations were built of wood, in particular large posts and tree trunks. A mile from Stonehenge is Doington Walls, which was a large inhabited settlement surrounded by a ditch. Inside are a number of circles, made not from stone but from wood, and many circular houses constructed with wooden posts. The rubbish left behind at this and similar sites provides archaeologists with insights into the lives of the inhabitants. Chemical analysis of animal bone debris, for example, indicates that the animals consumed came from great distances before they were slaughtered, and therefore that the people who stayed here had come from regions far removed from the site. Significantly, both Stonehenge and Dington walls are connected to the Avon River by banked avenues. These connected the worlds of the living with the domain of the dead. Neolithic people would have moved between these worlds as they walked the avenues, sometimes bringing the deceased to be buried or cremated, other times approaching the stone circle for ceremonies and rituals dedicated to the memories of the deceased and the very ancient ancestors. The meaning of Stonehenge therefore rests within an understanding of the larger landscape that contained not only other ritual sites but also sites of habitation. Sculpture and ceramics, in addition to domestic and ceremonial architecture and a food-producing economy, the other critical component of the Neolithic way of life was the ability to make ceramic vessels. This pot revolution marked a shift from a complete reliance on skin, textile, and wooden containers to the use of pots made by firing clay. Pottery provided a new medium of extraordinary potential for shaping and decorating durable objects. Ceramic technology emerged independently, at different times, across the globe, with the earliest examples being produced by the Jomon culture of hunter-gatherers in Japan in 12,000 BCE, Fig. 24. It is extremely difficult to determine with certainty why pottery was first invented or why subsequent cultures adopted it. The idea that pottery would only emerge out of farming settlements is confounded by the example of the Jomon. Rather, it seems that there was no one set of social, economic, or environmental circumstances that led to the invention of ceramics. It is likely that the technology for producing ceramics evolved in stages. Archaeologist Karen Vitelli's detailed studies of the early Neolithic site of Franchthai Cave in Greece have shown that pottery making at this site started with an experimental stage during which non-specialist potters produced a small number of pots. These early pots were used in ceremonies, especially those where medicinal or narcotic plants were consumed, Fig. 25, only later did specialist potters share manufacturing recipes to produce enough pots for standard activities such as cooking and eating. A similar pattern may have occurred in other early potting communities. In addition to firing clay to make pots, cups, pitchers, and large storage containers, Neolithic people made thousands of miniature figures of humans. While it was once thought that these figurines referred to fertility cults and matriarchal societies, archaeologists now agree that they had many different functions, for example, as toys, portraits, votives. More importantly, specialists have shown that there are great degrees of similarity in figurine shape and decoration within distinct cultural regions. Such regional similarities, and the huge numbers of Neolithic figurines that would have been in circulation at any one place in time, have convinced experts that the critical significance of these objects is that they mark the emergence of the human body as the core location of human identity. Thus, the central role the body has played in the politics, philosophy, and art of historical and modern times began over 8,000 years ago with Neolithic figurines. Neolithic figures of humans were most numerous and diverse in Central and Eastern Europe, but in the Near Eastern site of Ain Ghazal in modern Jordan, archaeologist Gary Rolifson found 32 extraordinary human figures, Fig. 27. Dated to 6,500 BCE and constructed by covering bundled twig cores with layers of plaster, the statues were found in two pits. One contained 12 busts and 13 full figures, and in the other were 2 full figures, 2 fragmental busts, and 3 figures with 2 heads. These statues, each about 3 feet tall, are disturbing for many modern viewers, especially the startlingly stylized faces. The eyes, made with cowrie shells outlined with bitumen, also used to represent pupils, are wide open, giving the figures a lifelike appearance. Nostrils are also clearly defined, even exaggerated, but the mouths are discreet and tight-lipped. Clothes and other features were painted on the bodies. The powerful legs and feet are clearly modeled independently with plaster, but the strangely spindly arms and tiny, tapering hands cling closely to the body, as if inert. The impression is of living, breathing individuals who are unable to gesture or speak. Scholars have searched for clues about the function of these figures. The people who lived in Ein Ghazal built and rebuilt their houses, replastered walls, and buried their dead under house floors. They even dug down through the floors to retrieve the skulls of long-deceased relatives, just like the inhabitants of Catalhoyuk. They used the same plaster to coat the walls of their houses and to make the human figures. The site also contains buildings that may have served special, potentially ceremonial functions, and some suggest that the figures are linked to these rites. In addition to the figures' lifelike appearance, the similarity between the burial of bodies under house floors and the burial of the plaster figures in pits is striking. At the same time, however, there are significant differences. The statues are buried in groups while the human bodies are not. The statues are buried in pits, not in houses, and the eyes of the statues are open, as if they are alive and awake. In the current state of research, it is difficult to know with certainty how the figures of Ein Ghazal were used and what they meant to the people who made them. New metallurgy, enduring stone. The technology of metallurgy is closely allied to that of ceramics. Although Neolithic culture persisted in northern Europe until about 2000 BCE, the age of metals made its appearance in much of Europe about 3000 BCE. In Central and Southern Europe, and in the Aegean region, copper, gold, and tin had been mined, worked, and traded even earlier. Smelted and cast copper beads and ornaments dated to 4000 BCE have been discovered in Poland. Metals were first used for ornamentation. Gold was one of the first metals to be used in prehistory, used to make jewelry or to ornament clothing. Toward the end of the Neolithic, people shaped simple beads by cold hammering malachite, a green-colored, copper carbonate mineral that can be found on the surface of the ground in many regions. Over time, the objects made from gold and copper became more complicated and technologies of extraction and of metalworking improved. Ivan Ivanov discovered some of the most sensational prehistoric gold and copper objects in the late Neolithic cemetery at Varna on Bulgaria's Black Sea coast. While the cemetery consisted of several hundred graves of men, women, and children, a few special burials contained gold and copper artifacts. Figs 28-29. Objects such as gold-covered scepters, bracelets, beads, arm rings, lip plugs, and copper axes and chisels distinguish the graves of a small number of adult males, and in a very few of them, no skeleton was present. Instead, the body was represented by a clay mask richly decorated with gold adornments. Fig 28, and the grave contained extraordinary concentrations of metal and special marine shell ornaments. As in other prehistoric contexts, death and its attendant ceremonies were the focus for large and visually expressive displays of status and authority. The Bronze Age, the period that followed the introduction of metalworking, is commonly called the Bronze Age. Although copper is relatively abundant in Central Europe and in Spain, objects fashioned from it are too soft to be functional and therefore usually have a ceremonial or representational use and value. However, bronze, an alloy, or mixture, of tin and copper, is a stronger, harder substance with a wide variety of uses. The development of bronze, especially for weapons such as daggers and short swords, changed the peoples of Europe in fundamental ways. While copper ore was widely available across Europe either as surface outcrops or easily mined, the tin that was required to make bronze had a much more limited natural distribution and often required extraction by mining. Power bases shifted within communities as the resources needed to make bronze were not widely available to all. Trade and intergroup contacts across the continent and into the Near East increased, and bronze objects circulated as prized goods. Rock carving's Bronze Age artistry is not limited to metalworking. Indeed, some of the most exciting imagery of the period is found in the rock art of Northern Europe. For 1,000 years, starting around 1500 BCE, people created designs by scratching outlines and packing and grinding the surface of exposed rock faces using stone hammers and sometimes grains of sand as an abrasive. The Swedish region of northern Bohuslän is especially rich in rock carvings dating to this period. Archaeologists have recorded over 40,000 individual images from more than 1,500 sites. The range of motifs is wide, including boats, animals, people, wheeled vehicles and plows, and weapons. Within this range, however, the majority of images are boats, Fig. 30, not just in Sweden but across northern Europe. Interestingly, the boat images are unlike the boats that archaeologists have excavated. The rock-engraved images do not have masts, nor are they the dugouts or log boats that are known from this period. Instead, they represent boats made from wooden planks or with animal skins. What is the meaning of these boat images? Most agree that the location of the majority of the rock art near current or past shorelines is the critical clue to their meaning. Archaeologist Richard Bradley suggests that rock art connects sky, earth, and sea, perhaps visualizing the community's view of the three-part nature of the universe. Others suggest that the art is intentionally located between water and earth to mark a boundary between the world of the living and the world of spirits. In this view, the permanent character of the rock, grounded deep in the earth, provided a means of communication and connection between distant and distinct worlds. For people of the prehistoric era, representational and abstract art had critical symbolic importance, justifying the labor required to paint in the deep recesses of caves, move enormous stones great distances, or create elaborately ornamented masks. Prehistoric art and architecture connected the earthly with the spiritual, established social power hierarchies, and perhaps helped people learn and remember information about the natural world that was critical for their survival. This art represents one of the fundamental elements of our development as a human species. 2. Art of the ancient Near East. In public works such as the stone stele, the artists of Mesopotamia developed a suave and sophisticated symbolic visual language, a kind of conceptual art, that both celebrated and communicated the political stratification that gave order and security to their world. Akkadian ruler Naram-Sin is pictured proudly here, Fig. His preeminence is signaled directly by size. He is by far the largest person in this scene of military triumph, conforming to an artistic practice we call hierarchic scale, where relative size indicates relative importance. He is also elevated well above the other figures, boldly silhouetted against blank ground. Even the shape of the stone slab is an active part of the composition. Its tapering top perfectly accommodates the carved mountain within it, and Naram-Sin is posed to reflect the profile of both, increasing his own sense of grandeur by association. He clasps a veritable arsenal of weaponry: spear, battle-axe, bow and arrow, and the grand helmet that crowns his head sprouts horns, an attribute heretofore reserved for gods. By wearing it here, he is claiming divinity for himself. Art historian Irene Winter has gone even further, pointing to the eroticized pose and presentation of Naram-Sin, to the alluring display of a well-formed male body. In ancient Mesopotamian culture, male potency and vigor were directly related to mythical heroism and powerful kingship. Thus every aspect of the representation of this ruler speaks to his sacred and political authority as leader of the state. This stele is more than an emblem of Naram-Sin's divine right to rule, however. It also tells the story of one of his important military victories. The ruler stands above a crowded scene enacted by smaller figures. Those to the left, dressed and posed in a fashion similar to their ruler, represent his army, marching in diagonal bands up the hillside into battle. The artist has included identifiable native trees along the mountain pathway to heighten the sense that this portrays an actual event rather than a generic battle scene. Before Naram-Sin, both along the right side of the stele and smashed under his forward striding leg, are representations of the enemy, in this case the Lalubi people from eastern Mesopotamia. One diminutive adversary has taken a fatal spear to the neck, while companions behind and below him beg for mercy. Taller than most people who stand in front of it, and carved of eye-catching pink stone, this sumptuous work of ancient art maintains the power to communicate with us forcefully and directly, even across over 4 millennia of historical distance. We will discover in this chapter that powerful symbolism and dynamic storytelling are not unique to this one stele. They are signal characteristics of royal art in the ancient Near East. The Fertile Crescent and Mesopotamia. Well before farming communities appeared in Europe, people in Asia Minor and the ancient Near East were already domesticating grains in an area known today as the Fertile Crescent map. In the 6th or 5th millennium BCE, agriculture developed in the alluvial plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which the Greeks called Mesopotamia, meaning the land between the rivers, now in present-day Iraq. Because of problems with periodic flooding as well as drought, there was a need for large-scale systems to control the water supply. Meeting this need may have contributed to the development of the first cities. Between 4000 and 3000 BCE, a major cultural shift seems to have taken place. Agricultural villages evolved into cities simultaneously and independently in both northern and southern Mesopotamia. These prosperous cities joined with their surrounding territories to create what are known as city-states, each with its own gods and government. Social hierarchies, rulers and workers, emerged with the development of specialized skills beyond those needed for agricultural work. To grain mills and ovens were added brick and pottery kilns and textile and metal workshops. With extra goods and even modest affluence came increased trade and contact with other cultures. Organized religion played an important role, and the people who controlled rituals and the sacred sites eventually became full-time priests. The people of the ancient Near East worshipped numerous gods and goddesses. Every city had its special protective deity, and the fate of the city was seen as dependent on the power of that deity. Large architectural complexes, clusters of religious, administrative, and service buildings developed in each city as centers of ritual and worship and also of government. Although the stone-free alluvial plain of southern Mesopotamia was prone to floods and droughts, it was a fertile bed for agriculture and successive, interlinked societies. But its wealth and agricultural resources, as well as its few natural defenses, made Mesopotamia vulnerable to political upheaval. Over the centuries, the balance of power shifted between north and south and between local powers and outside invaders. First, the Sumerians controlled the south, filling their independent city-states with the fruits of new technology, developed literacy, and impressive art and architecture. Then they were eclipsed by the Akkadians, their neighbors to the north. When invaders from farther north in turn conquered the Akkadians, the Sumerians regained power locally. During this period, the city-states of Ur and Lagash thrived under strong leaders. The Amorites were next to dominate the south. Under them and their king, Hammurabi, a new, unified society arose with its capital in the city of Babylon. Sumer. The cities and city-states that developed along the rivers of southern Mesopotamia between about 3500 and 2340 BCE are known collectively as Sumer. The Sumerians are credited with important technological and cultural advances. They may have invented the wagon wheel and the plow. But perhaps their greatest contribution to later civilizations was the invention in 3200 BCE of the first form of written script. Writing Sumerians pressed cuneiform symbols into clay tablets with a stylus, a pointed writing instrument, to keep business records. Thousands of surviving Sumerian tablets have allowed scholars to trace the gradual evolution of writing and arithmetic, another tool of commerce, as well as an organized system of justice. The world's first literary epic is Sumerian in origin, although the fullest surviving version of this tale is written in Akkadian, the language of Sumer's neighbors to the north. The Epic of Gilgamesh records the adventures of a legendary Sumerian king of Uruk and his companion Enkidu. When Enkidu dies, a despondent King Gilgamesh sets out to find the secret of eternal life from the only man and woman who had survived a great flood sent by the gods to destroy the world, because the gods had granted them immortality. Gilgamesh ultimately accepts his own mortality, abandons his quest, and returns to Uruk, recognizing the majestic city as his lasting accomplishment. The ziggurat. The Sumerians' most impressive surviving archaeological remains are ziggurats, huge step structures with a temple or shrine on top. The first ziggurats may have developed from the practice of repeated rebuilding at a sacred site, with rubble from one structure serving as the foundation for the next. Elevating the buildings also protected the shrines from flooding. Whatever the origin of their design, ziggurats towering above the flat plain proclaimed the wealth, prestige, and stability of a city's rulers and glorified its gods. Ziggurats function symbolically too, as lofty bridges between the earth and the heavens, a meeting place for humans and their gods. They were given names such as House of the Mountain and Bond between heaven and earth. Uruk. Two large temple complexes in the 1,000-acre city at Uruk mark the first independent Sumerian city-state. One was dedicated to Inanna, the goddess of love and war, while the other complex belonged to the sky god Anu. The temple platform of Anu, built up in stages over the centuries, ultimately rose to a height of about 40 feet. Around 3100 BCE, a whitewashed mud brick temple that modern archaeologists refer to as the White Temple was erected on top of the platform, Fig. This now ruined structure was a simple rectangle with an off-center doorway that led into a large chamber containing an altar and smaller spaces open to each side. Statues of gods and donors were placed in Sumerian temples. A striking life-size marble face from Uruk, Fig. May represent a temple goddess. It could have been attached to a wooden head on a full-size wooden body. Now stripped of its original paint, wig, and the inlay set in for brows and eyes, it appears as a stark white mask. Shells may have been used for the whites of the eyes and lapis lazuli for the pupils, and the hair may have been gold. A tall vessel of carved alabaster found in the temple complex of Inanna at Uruk, Fig. Shows how early Mesopotamian sculptors told stories in stone with great clarity and verve. The visual narrative is organized into 3 registers, or horizontal bands, and the story condensed to its essential elements. The lowest register shows in a lower strip the sources of life in the natural world, beginning with water and plants, and continuing in a superimposed upper strip, where alternating rams and ewes march single file along a solid ground line. In the middle register naked men carry baskets of foodstuffs, and in the top register, the goddess Inanna accepts an offering from 2 standing figures. Inanna stands in front of the gate to her richly filled shrine and storehouse, identified by 2 reed door poles hung with banners. The 2 men who face her are thought to be first a naked priest or acolyte presenting an offering-filled basket, followed by a partially preserved, ceremonially dressed figure of the priest-king, not visible in figure. The scene may represent a reenactment of the ritual marriage between the goddess and Dumuzi, her consort, a role taken by the priest-king, that took place during the New Year's festival to ensure the fertility of crops, animals, and people, and thus the continued survival of Uruk. Votive figures. Limestone statues dated to about 2900–2600 BCE from the Square Temple in Ishnana, Fig. Excavated in 1932–1933, reveal another aspect of Sumerian religious art. These votive figures of men and women, images dedicated to the gods, are directly related to an ancient Near Eastern devotional practice in which individual worshippers could set up images of themselves in a shrine before a larger, more elaborate image of a god. A simple inscription might identify the figure as one who offers prayers. Longer inscriptions might recount in detail all the things the donor had accomplished in the god's honor. Each sculpture served as a stand-in for the donor, locked in eye contact with the god, caught perpetually in the act of worship. The sculptors of these votive statues followed conventions that were important in Sumerian art. Figures have stylized faces and bodies, dressed in clothing that emphasizes pure cylindrical shapes. They stand solemnly, hands clasped in respect, perhaps a posture expected in devotional contexts. The bold, staring eyes may be related to statements in contemporary Sumerian texts that advise worshippers to approach their gods with an attentive gaze.